the summer of 1949. As the Greek Civil War came to its very tragic close, American policymakers had just about worked out a strategy of containment and counter-revolution. Because you see, they had learned in Greece how to deploy military supply, how to deploy economic aid and technical assistance in order fundamentally to close off the option of revolution in Greece and to turn the tide of the war. What I'm saying is that for American policymakers, Greece was what Vietnam would be a generation later, that essentially it was a great laboratory of learning how you do things that had to be done. But Greece was something more than just a laboratory for American policymakers. It also would become, from the end of that Civil War down to the present time, a showcase, a kind of model of political stabilization and of economic growth, because those American policymakers also learned how to manipulate economic and military power in order, if you please, to keep Greece within what was called the free world, and in order to insert what was a very, very bare economy into an American-led world order. And what we are concerned with, after all, is what that world order meant, not only to the Greek people, but to tens of millions of others who ultimately were to live under it, what Truman Doctrine democracy meant for those to whom its benefits presumably were to be carried. What we want to know, after all, is what the impact of this strategy of containment and counter-revolution is in a country like Greece. We want to ask the question, if you please, of what it meant to the Greek people that their political process became a function of counter-revolution. We want to ask what it meant to the Greek people that their economic growth was programmed by private American interests and by that very narrow Greek elite which was in collaboration with those interests. And we want to ask something very fundamental of what would happen if, after all, that economic growth in Greece, as distorted as it was, were to create internal contradictions in the society, as in fact it did in the middle of the 1960s, and forces emerged which made their demands and expressed aspirations that began to threaten the hegemony of the United States. And if that happened, what would be the reaction then of America creating presumably free choices inside Greece, imposing its Truman Doctrine democracy? And if you look over the history of those Greek people over the past 25 years, from the end of the Civil War down to the very present, there is one thing that is overwhelming and compelling about the history of that society. And that is that it is ruled persistently over that 25-year period, with the exception of one brief interlude in 1964 and 5 for a year and a half, but for the rest of the time it is ruled from the extreme right. What we are talking about is that Greek politics do become a function of counter-revolution. And in fact, that should not greatly surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us in the first place because the very cadre of the left had been decimated in the resistance and in the Civil War. That men and women, literally by the hundreds of thousands, who had been either of the left or sufficiently progressive, that they wanted some kind of a refurbishing of Greek democracy, some kind of a new start in Greek society, that by the hundreds of thousands, they either were killed or exiled in the course of that resistance movement, and especially of the Civil War. It should not surprise us in the second place because of the very clever use that right-wing governments made of anti-communist propaganda in the period from the end of the Civil War on. That the Civil War, after all, had been ultimately terroristic on both sides. That the communists and the pro-communist forces in desperation had in fact committed acts of atrocity. And the governments deployed that kind of propaganda very effectively to do something important, namely to destroy that very broad coalition of popular forces that had been at the root of the resistance movement. In other words, to part and to make a division between large numbers of peasants and of petty bourgeois from the effective force of the left, and consequently to immobilize that sector of Greek population, to push it off into a dead center of apathy so that the right could rule without very much opposition, and those peasants and that petty bourgeoisie would not effectively raise their voices or come back into Greek politics until the Papandreou movement of 1964 and 5, when suddenly they constitute again the backlog, as we will see, of some kind of a mass movement. Nor should it surprise us in the third place because of what really is primordial, and that is the American presence. That Greece, after all, becomes, within the framework of Truman Doctrine strategy, it becomes an American satrapy. That fundamentally it is the American embassy in Athens that really calls the turn in Greek politics. It is the era of Lloyd Henderson, the era of Henry Grady, the era of John Purifoy, of those American ambassadors who intervene actively and directly into the affairs of Greece. And when the Americans intervene, it is always to safeguard a very real anti-communist regime, one that will in no way permit opposition to the strategy that America is charting for Greece, that will in no way interfere with what the American purposes are. And you see what that means. It means that the United States gave its ultimate support over that 8-year period of the rule of the so-called Radical Union Party between 1955 and 1963 to Konstantin Karamanlis, who was the reactionary ruler, prime minister of Greece, gave him its full support, and then in 1965 supported King Constantine when he dismissed Papandreou because that center union movement had begun to become progressive and indeed a mass movement. And it is that American support for the military coup of April the 21st of 1967, which after all gives it its head and gives it its possibility and cadre. You see that in American policymakers' minds, there was at times the idea that a reformist regime, a kind of liberal regime, might be effectively co-optative. That's what all the bright policymakers around John Kennedy kept thinking, the Galbraights and the Bowleses and the like. That after all, it was better to have somewhat enlightened regimes doing the American interest than these kind of reactionary pro-Manion regimes that had been supported in the age of Foster Dulles. But don't be overwhelmed by that. That ultimately those programs of Alliance for Progress and so forth were always meant to be co-optative, but more than that, that American policymakers very quickly scrapped them. And they scrapped them whenever they seemed to get out of hand, whenever the very reforms themselves seemed to become dangerous. And I remember full well being in Japan at the time of the so-called Reischauer offensive, when Eddie Reischauer was our ambassador in Japan, and he a much more enlightened guy than Ambassador MacArthur. That was Arthur MacArthur, the nephew of General MacArthur, who really had a kind of a mailed fist and ruled with a hammer and a club. And Eddie Reischauer came as a good Harvard liberal to rule with a silken glove, and consequently to try to seduce the right wing of the Socialist Party in Japan, or the right wing of the trade union movement. But then you see, all of that didn't work. And I was down in Doshisha University in the south of Japan to be there to make a speech at the opening of what was called Amherst House. And why they asked me, I don't know. But it suffices to say I was in Doshisha, and Eddie Reischauer came to speak on the same program, and I got there and I spoke, and he couldn't get out of his car because the Zengakuren, the student movement, surrounded the car and began to shake it, shouting, "We don't want the Reischauer offensive." Well, you see, it wasn't working. And consequently, much more reliable always is the regime directly of the right. And so you have that very interesting and blunt commentary made by the political officer of the American embassy in Paraguay in 1971, when he was asked why the Americans, after all, supported the Stroessner dictatorship, which was one of the brutal dictatorships in South America, which kept 90% of the people illiterate, which kept them landless. And the answer that the political officer of the embassy gave was this: in the final analysis, our policy is one of survival. Thus, a sure anti-communist, no matter how despicable he may be, is better than a reformer, no matter how honest, who might turn against us. And consequently, in Greece, there was no question where the American force lay. It lay behind, very decisively and decidedly, right-wing governments. And consequently, it should not surprise us that over that 25-year period, except for one brief interval, Greece is ruled from that side. But it raises a number of questions. When we say that Greece is ruled from the right, it raises the question of what the strategy of that right is, of what the instruments of that counter-revolution are and who the beneficiaries are, which is crucially important and tells you a great deal about the impact of this kind of strategy upon third world peoples or peoples living in a society as underdeveloped as Greece. And when you ask what the strategy is, the strategy bluntly is anti-communism, or to put it perhaps in more institutional terms, it is the establishment of a sufficient police apparatus inside the society so that there is no viable opposition to the strategy approved by American policymakers, by the monarchy in Greece, and by the Greek elite. In other words, to contain what might be really an opposition movement. And that anti-communism took varied forms in Greece, and it's almost a model. It took, quite obviously, the form of outlawing communism per se, so that the Communist Party of Greece was officially outlawed by the law of the 27th of December of 1947 in the midst of the Civil War. And with that outlawing of the Communist Party, IAM, the resistance party, was also outlawed, and included were all things called Communist Front organizations. Now the communists then officially disappeared, and the party itself went into exile and remained in exile, but those communists who remained inside Greece and who were able to form anything at all formed a party in 1951 called EDA, E-D-A, or the United Democratic Left. And EDA was a kind of social democratic coalition between communists and socialists and certain progressive liberals, and consequently never was a socialist party, was basically a party for progressive reforms inside the cadre of the existing Greek society. And it had a certain strength in the 1950s. At the 1958 elections, EDA received 27% of the vote, elected 79 deputies, but after that, you see, it gets very heavily repressed, and the government comes down very strongly on what it considers to be now simply a communist front party and begins to repress it very harshly. So that you get communism per se as an entity that you can define, quite obviously suppressed. But that, you see, isn't the point. That's not the point of anti-communism. The point of anti-communism in the United States or any place else is really to strike at dissent, is really to circumscribe the right to mount any kind of opposition movement to what the ongoing programs or what the ongoing strategy happens to be. And in that, the Greek government was rich in a kind of ingenuity, so that it used administrative fiat, for example, so that the Ministry of Internal Security in Greece could simply take police reports, and on the basis of police reports could deport anyone considered to be a subversive to one of the Greek islands to be placed in a prison or in a concentration camp. But it's more than that. It's that old principle that the French call the livret. In other words, the passbook, what is called the passbook really in South Africa. It is the certification of good citizenship by a law of January 30th, 1948. In order to hold public employment or semi-public employment in Greece, it was necessary to have what was called a certificate of good conduct or good citizenship, which basically meant you were not a communist or what was called a crypto-communist. In other words, a sympathizer. But what is most interesting about that is that that gets extended beyond public or semi-public employment to all employment. So that if you want a job as a tobacco worker, or you want a job on a building site, or if you want any kind of menial labor job, you must have such certification. And you see, that puts tremendous power into the hands of the police. And I want you to note this well, because I'm going to circumscribe this theme at a later point separately, that it is my contention that one of the fundamental morphological changes that have come about in contemporary societies is basically the extent and the autonomous independent power of policing populations. And surely you get it in a country like Greece in an extremely sophisticated form, so that by 1963, the police had dossier on 1.5 million people in a society that didn't even have a population of 10 million. Well, you see what that means. That means if you get out of line, If you demonstrate, if you express dissident opinions, you may be excluded from a job. And what it does is to provide a fantastic form of social control. And you see, if you understand something about the paranoia of police, if you understand that they see subversion everywhere, if you understand that they are trained and picked in order to find subversion even where it doesn't exist, then you understand what André Glixman means, and with which I wholeheartedly agree, that in contemporary societies, fascism may not take the form, after all, that it has taken in classic and historic ways, with mass movements and centered around irrational populations, but it may be what Glixman calls the occupation of the government by the Ministry of the Interior. In other words, in which an autonomous police is able to control populations by its fichier, by the kind of dossier it has on people, by its files, by its surveillance, and the lot. And you know, parenthetically, I live so much of the time and so much of my life in France, and where I have seen Marcelin, who is the Minister of the Interior in that country, and who is a paranoid of the first order, and who sees subversion everywhere, and has built up dossier. The French keep dossier anyway about everything, and they pile up. No matter what you do, you have a big dossier. And if you live there a period of time, and you still have blood in your veins, you're sure really to be in their bad graces. And under Marcelin, it has just become fantastic. And so I was really quite shocked the last year that I was there, because a man named Denis Langlois, who is a very good civil liberties lawyer, published a book in France called Le Dossier Noir sur la Police Française, the black book of the French police, in which he cited a number of documents that had been slipped to him from the Ministry of the Interior to show what kind of surveillance was being done. And I was reading this book, and there was this long document about the fact that Paris had become a center of world revolution, and that all these foreigners were around in the damn city, and that they were centering themselves there in order to build up revolutionary movements in their country. And it listed 75 countries that had revolutionary movements centered in Paris. And finally, it got down to the United States, and the only two people that were named there was one, Mariah Jolas. Mariah Jolas is a great friend of mine. She's 82 years old. She's a great authority on James Joyce. She's lived there 50 years. She's editing Joyce's correspondence, but she happens to have spoken out on a few issues. The other one was me. Now, it struck me as being very, very strange. Yeah, it was very flattering in a certain way. But I thought that really the world revolutionary movement was in terrible shape. If this 82-year-old woman and this broken-down professor were the center really of this particular kind of subversion. And so I finally thought I ought to get to the bottom of this thing. So I went to get my carte de séjour renewed, and I was having more and more trouble getting the thing renewed. They were just harassing, and so you wait 5 weeks or 6 weeks and so forth to get your resident card renewed. The last time, I had to go up to the 5th floor, that's the political police, to see Monsieur Balaget. He's an old friend of mine now, I've seen him so often. And I went up there and I said, this is ridiculous. I had the book with me. I said, Marcelin's going off his head. I mean, quite obviously, this is just sheer paranoia, this kind of thing. And he said, well, I don't know. And he said, let me call for your dossier. Well, the dossier gets bigger and bigger. You live, it gets bigger, obviously. You say something here, there, and the other place. And he says, he looks in the dossier. He says, you know, vous n'êtes pas sage. You're not really too clever, are you? And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, is the embassy getting angry because I've been talking about Vietnam? He said, well, yes, that's I said, but that's just very recent. That's just very recent. That wouldn't irritate Marcelin. It must be Algeria, isn't it? Well, of course it was. And that was the sensitive thing in the thing. Well, the problem was, he handed me then the sheet that I had to sign, which said that I wouldn't engage in political activity on the threat of being expelled within 12 hours. I didn't want to be expelled in 12 hours. It was just pro forma, you know, and so forth. You have no right. But you see, I'm an American, and consequently, I have all this power behind me. But you can imagine how it is if you're Portuguese or if you're Spanish, or if you're just a French worker, for example, and have no resources at all at your disposal. Well, put it all in the context of Greece and understand what it means, for example, to talk about good citizenship in those terms, and you see how difficult it is then to mount anything contrary to this particular right. Now, the consequence of that is most conspicuous in terms of the weakening of the trade union movement in Greece. That trade union movement, weak anyway, from the point of view that you have really a small number of workers, you have not had an industrial program that has enabled you to build up a sizable proletariat, but weak because of the constant surveillance, because the government did install a reactionary leadership in 1946 when Saldaris simply ousted the communist leadership of the Greek Confederation of Labor. Weak because every member union in the General Confederation of Labor in Greece must promise to fight communism. Weak because the regime put surveillance over all kinds of labor activity. There is a special sector of the Greek police dedicated to nothing but that overseership of labor. Now you see what the importance of that is. If there is to be investment in Greece, if it is to be profitable, it is because there is a docile and cheap labor force, and that is guaranteed, after all, by the kind of manipulation of this principle of anti-communism built into this police structure of the regime in Greece. And there is a corollary to that, a corollary that is really very sad. If we say anti-communism as a positive strategy, what we mean as a corollary is the purging from Greek consciousness and from Greek life and from Greek history of the resistance. It is fantastic that Greece is the only country in Europe where the people mounted a war against the German occupation where they have taken no pride in it, where it has not been celebrated at the national level. In every other country where there was a resistance movement, people after the resistance fought for the prestige of saying they were Resistants. Somebody in Amsterdam told me that there are more people in that city who claim to have been in the Dutch resistance than live in the city, because that became a prestige item. Not so in Greece, not mentioned in the schools. The victims of the occupation, the maimed, not given pensions, no monuments to the fighters in the resistance, and finally, not even a celebration until October of 1964 of the liberation of Athens 20 years earlier. All of that to be forgotten because, you see, the resistance was a mass movement, and that the regime, after all, had to eliminate as any kind of an example or any kind of a model. And so we talk about strategy, and then we ask the questions of the tenets of power. We ask what the instruments of this right wing were. The instruments, quite obviously, the right-wing party in the first instance within the parliamentary or constitutional structure. And the right-wing party that dominated much of this period after the Civil War was a party called the ERE, or the Radical Union Party. The Radical Union Party, which was in office continuously under Karamanlis between 1955 and 1963. And which was really an offshoot of the old reactionary monarchist party called the Populist Party. Now, why the right-wing parties should have won persistently, again, should be no great surprise. It shouldn't be a great surprise from 3 points of view. First of all, that the bureaucracy, and note it well, the police and the bureaucracy in Greece were never purged. It's the one country that did not have the left in office ever in order to make a post-occupation purge. That the collaborationists, the pro-Nazis, the pro-Metaxas people who had been in the Greek bureaucracy and police remained there. All of which means that to have an apparatus of coercion in order to guarantee tricked elections or controlled elections. In the second place, you have really a very weak opposition. And this goes back to our original analysis of Greek history, that the opposition is the so-called liberal opposition, that is an offshoot of the Venizelos movement. And those liberals, first of all, until 1961, until they organized what was called the Center Union Party under old George Papandreou, until 61, the liberals were divided. They were fissured into little groups, each following its own particular leader. But something more than that. And that is that Greek liberalism never really offered an alternative Weltanschauung. It never had an alternative strategy for Greece, not certainly until the mid-1960s. It was the outs rather than the ins. They were politicians with their clientele, and they wanted place in the Greek government. But they did the bidding of the British, and they did the bidding of the Americans. And there really was nothing in that centrist movement, that liberal movement, that had anything like a program to offer the Greek people around which anybody could rally. But there's something else, and note it well, and that is that the center, or the liberals, no matter how much they did the British and the American bidding, found that the Americans didn't like them. And that I discovered in Athens when I went to see the political officer, a Mr. Miller. And I said, you know, that the liberals say that you're terrible here. This was during the Karaman lease period, because you never invite them to the embassy. They can't even get inside. And he said, well, why should we invite them? Because this radical union is safe, it's in power, it's going to remain there forever. This was about 6 months before Karaman fell, incidentally, which shows you what kind of an astute diplomacy we have. But it suffices to say, he said, they're going to be there forever. We don't have to see these liberals, who really are a kind of an unsure bunch anyway. The point is that American diplomacy really ousted these liberals from any kind of consideration, and certainly hated them in the period of the 1960s. And there's a marvelous illustration of that, which tells you a great deal about how Greek politics worked in that period of Truman Doctrine democracy. The Americans were a bit upset, our policymakers in Greece, over the instability of the Greek government between 1947 and 52. That is, that the Greek right really was too divided or fissured into several parties. And you'd have these elections, and there would be all kinds of coalition governments, and they really weren't very safe or stable. Now, between 47 and 52, the United States poured $2.5 billion worth of aid into Greece. And damn it, we wanted something. We wanted mileage out of that kind of aid, and what we wanted was a strong, solid, stable, conservative government in that country. Now that we were promised in 1952 when a General Papagos, organized the right in Greece into a single party called the Greek Rally. And this ambassador in Athens from the United States, John Purifoy, he loved that particular party, and he thought, finally, this has resolved the problem. At that point, the centrists, the liberals, said that in the elections of 1952, there must be proportional representation. And they fought and made a big campaign for proportional representation, which meant that they might be able to undercut, even with a variety of parties, they might be able to undercut this so-called Greek rally of General Papagos. And at that point, in a very famous episode, Ambassador Purifoy, on the 14th of June of 1952, intervened directly and said publicly in Athens, proportional representation will only mean government instability in Greece. That will undermine the effectiveness of American aid, which may then be curtailed. Well, there was no proportional representation. Obviously, it was the male fist. The ambassador was saying, either you permit this right-wing party to win this election clear and even, or we will simply cut off aid. And Purifoy did that. There was a certain stir over his intervention, but he had the clout to do it. And I want to point out to you parenthetically that you see John Purifoy, and you should remember a name like John Purifoy because he really is one of the great John Waynes of American diplomacy. And Purifoy, you see, was just cutting his teeth here in Greece because the next year, in the middle of 1953, we find him off, do we not, in Guatemala. And that was too bad for Senor Arbenz, who happened to be the head of the Guatemalan government and was something of a reformer. Well, Arbenz had been in power in Guatemala for 3 years. He had banned the Communist Party. He really wasn't much of a subversive, not terribly dangerous, but he had in Guatemala, you see, all of these poverty-stricken peasants, these poor Indians, and consequently he looked around and he saw all of this land in the hands of the United Fruit Company. And he said, obviously, we won't take the banana land, but there's lots of land United Fruit has that is simply unoccupied. And so he said, the Guatemalan government will take back 225,000 acres of land that are not being used, but we will pay for them. Well, the paying for them is what created the difficulty, because what Arbenz said is we will pay exactly the assessment value that United Fruit has claimed for tax purposes. Well, quite obviously, they were furious. The State Department said that that was insane, and consequently, that it could not be. Well, then Purifoy got there, and this is Purifoy writing back to the State Department at the end of 1953 about poor Arbenz, and he says this, and it really is a magnificent comment. Arbenz thinks like a communist, talks like a communist, and if not actually a communist, he will do until a real one comes along. And finally, in June of 1954, with American guns and American plane cover, you get the coup that overthrows this reformist regime in Guatemala and installs a very reactionary one, which shows you really what Purifoy was making a trial run on when he was insisting that the Papagos government come into power in Greece in 1952. Parenthetically, you just really cannot even extend your imagination far enough to know what money can do and what power can do. And I tell you this little story about Guatemala. Well, out in Paris, in the Guatemalan embassy for a number of years, was a very distinguished writer as the ambassador, a man named Miguel Asturias, who won the Nobel Prize. And because Asturias was involved with the Russell Tribunal and the anti-Vietnam War movement and so forth, I got to know him. And I used to go to the Guatemalan embassy in Paris, and he said to me one day, and I thought that this was, one of those fictive things that was a fiction of his imagination. He said, I am the first Guatemalan ambassador to Paris in 25 years who is not in the pay of the American government. Well, I said, I could imagine that for the Guatemalan ambassador in Washington, but the one in Paris, I said, you mean that in a figurative way, that is sold to the Americans in a figurative? No, he said, I mean no literal way. And he showed me the documentation that there actually was payment to these particular Guatemalan diplomatic personnel. Why? Because the Guatemalans had only one important embassy in Europe, and that was in Paris, and consequently, when they sent students over, a few elite students to study, they simply wanted a proper overseership of these students to make sure that they weren't imbibing radical ideas with which they would then undermine Guatemalan administration. And so you see what kind of an extent, what kind of strange tentacles the whole policy of containment ultimately begins then to have. So that you get, quite obviously, this kind of American commitment. The right-wing government began then, or the right-wing party, began with the Greek rally of Papagos in 1952, which clearly won the elections of 52, got 247 seats out of 300, and did really things that American policymakers liked. Because the Minister of Coordination, by which we mean the Minister of Planning, of Economic Planning in Greece, was Spiros Markazinas. And Markazinas became really a kind of mouthpiece for American investment, because Markazinas, who became the strong man in the Papagos government, provided a policy that he really invited in American capital. What he decided in the first place was to remove all legal obstacles to foreign imports into Greece. And secondly, he pushed through that famous law of the 31st of October of 1953, Law 2687, which is the law on foreign investment. And the law on foreign investment, after all, provides for the absolute guarantee of foreign investment, that it cannot be nationalized, that it is safe at all times, and secondly, provided tremendous tax relief for all of those who were developing the Greek economy by this kind of foreign investment. Papagos himself ingratiated himself to the Americans by the military agreement of the 12th of October of 1953, because by that agreement, the United States got the right to build military bases and maintain them inside Greece, to use Greek roads and railroads for the passage of troops, and also, which was extraordinary for 1953, to get the right to quarter American troops in Greece with extraterritorial privileges. In other words, not subject as resident in Greece, actually to Greek law. Now, all of that was very neat, but you see, sometimes nature takes its course and disrupts a program. And it's disrupted often, as it was on the 5th of October of 1955, by nature. General Papagos died. And when Papagos died, quite obviously, there was a sudden kind of vacuum, and the king intervened. And the king was King Paul of Greece. And King Paul intervened, and he said, all right, I will choose to replace Papagos, the Minister of Public Works, who at that time was a kind of second-rate figure, and whose name was Constantine Karamanlis. And Karamanlis was relatively unknown. He didn't come from one of the great elite families, but he became, over the next 8 years, really the strongman of the Greek right, and very much an instrument for maintaining Greece within the entire vision of what American policymakers were concerned about. And Karamanlis was chosen for two reasons. He was chosen, first of all, because of this fantastic loyalty that he had to the king. And the king was concerned about that. The kings had not been loved in the 20th century in Greece, and having great loyalty was really a desideratum. And that meant for Karamanlis something very important, because if the king loved him, and if he was loyal to the king, it meant that his regime always had the support of the army, always had the support of the general corps in the army especially, which was very monarchist and very devoted to the royal house. And the significance of that should not escape you, because you must understand that in Greece during all of this period, the army administers a rather wide zone. It administers, after all, what's called the zone of surveillance, which is all along that 1,200-kilometer northern frontier. And it's a zone that contains, in 1961, contained about 1 million people and in a population of about 8.25 million at that particular time. So that in those zones, the army, you see, could ensure very substantial electoral victories for the government in power, for this right-wing government. Consider that in the 1961 elections, the ERE, the Radical Union, on the overall, got 51% of the vote in Greece, but in that zone of occupation of the military, it got 94% of the vote. Well, the differential shouldn't escape you. It obviously simply is army coercion, all of which was good for the Karamanlis regime. The other thing was that the Americans liked him. They had gotten to know Karamanlis when he was Minister of Public Works. He had been very, very cooperative in building the infrastructure that the American army people wanted. And in addition to that, he was sufficiently fanatical on the communist question. Or, as Foster Dulles said, he believes in Western values. And by Western values, after all, was meant that he was willing to undertake the crusade and to open the Greek market very favorably to American investors. And so Karamanlis came in with that kind of support and really lasted for 8 years. The regime was awful. I was in Greece a great deal during those years of the Karamanlis period between 55 and 63, and it really was a police state. That is to say, the operation or the apparatus of the police really was ubiquitous. You got the so-called security police, which really were Praetorian guards for the Radical Union Party, but more than that, you got what was called the National Security Battalions. These were army battalions at the village level, run by military officers, really to have surveillance over the villages, and then finally the Greek intelligence service. The Greek intelligence service, which was really organized by the CIA, which worked in very close cooperation with it, and which quite obviously was ferreting out subversion wherever it could. But you see, all of that is constitutional. You have a right-wing party, it's out in front. The crucial thing about Greek politics in this period is the existence of extra-constitutional forces that can and do intervene when the moment is right, when the moment seems propitious. One of those forces, quite obviously, the monarchy. Now, the Greek monarchy, not loved in the 20th century, a little bit uptight about its lack of popularity. There has been a republic for a 10-year period between 1924 and 35. And the king, George II, would never have come back to Greece if the resistance had been able to beat the British. And consequently, the royal house, Paul and his queen Frederica, supported any group or any party that was utterly devoted to the monarchy. But it's something more than that. It is that the monarchy had no raison d'etre. It had no reason to exist in Greece, except insofar as it did the work of a Greek elite, insofar as it did the work of the great bankers and the great shippers, the Onassuses, the Niarchoses, and so forth in Greece. Now, I want to tell you something about that. Because when I say to do the work of that elite, I'm talking about a kind of Greek capitalism that is unlike anything you recognize in Western Europe. Let us say in Western Europe, in Great Britain or in France, the capitalist class comes ultimately to understand that it can work with social democratic parties. Socialists come to power, Willy Brandt comes to power in Germany, it's no great catastrophe. Harold Wilson comes to power in England, the London Economist says he's the best conservative prime minister we could have. And consequently, there's no really great threat. And when in France, for example, Guy Mollet is the prime minister in 1956, he's the one that really escalates the war against the Algerian liberation movement. And so there is a sophistication, not in Greece. The Civil War had burned those Greek capitalists. They really had been burned by what they considered a terrible and a permanent threat. And instead of the Civil War making them more tractable, it made them more intransigent. And the one force that they felt always stood for an absolutely unchanging society, one in which productive relationships would never be altered or modified, was the monarchy. And so the monarchy intervened, not against communism, but against any threat of reformism. That's why King Constantine intervened in July of 1965 to oust Papandreou and the Center Union Party at a time when it had introduced a very mild reform program. The second extra-constitutional force, the creation of your government, the Greek army. By 1967, when there are less than 10 million people in Greece, the Greek army numbers 160,000 armed men. It numbers 37,000 reserves. It has a division of Patton M47 tanks. It has ground-to-ground missiles. It has 10,000 officers, and I want you to think about that. And I want you to understand that that is created, quite obviously, by the military aid program that the United States sends to Greece. It is created by the arms that the Pentagon sells to the Greek government. It is created, after all, to make capability out of NATO and in order to sell American weapons. But I want you to ask the question in your own mind, what it means when American policy really arms the armies of the Third World to such a point that the differential of power between those armies and the people that manipulate them and the rest of society is so vast that there is no way of coping with it. What are the implications of that? Ask any Chilean. And consequently, it is that Greek army that is that way armed. Ideologically, well, if you can talk about an ideology on the part of the Greek officer corps, look, that in the 20th century, you can count 20 rebellions that are mounted inside the Greek officer corps. And you can count 30 secret societies organized by factions of officers. That down until 1935, these rebellions and these secret societies were sometimes progressive, sometimes Nasserite, in other words, modernist, really wanting a new opening in Greek society. Then you get under Metaxas, really the purge of the Greek army. And after the Civil War, really a fundamental purge, so that all officers who fought against the Germans in the occupation are ousted. And the ones that are in command are the ones that have fought against the communists in the Civil War. It is Papikos who put at the very top levels the people who organized the concentration camps for the communists in the course of the Greek Civil War. And so when you talk about ideology, you are talking about blind devotion to the monarchy, you are talking about great devotion to the United States, which is the source of their largesse, you are talking about a fanatical anti-communism. These Greek generals fancy themselves to be Soviet mobs. In other words, a kind of expert group on the Soviet Union. And you read then in the army manuals and so forth, all kinds of those fantastic tales about the potentiality of a Soviet descent immediately upon Greece and upon the danger to its national security. So that the army stands ready to intervene when there is a threat. The final extra constitutional force, the United States. American policymakers were swarming across Greece. And you have to understand something about a country like that. I've been in a lot of countries like that, in which there are American advisors at every level. In the economic administration, in the Ministry of Coordination, for example, there are American technical advisors to suggest what kind of infrastructure there should be. To the Army, quite obviously, American officers to design how the strategy should go, how the weapons should be used. In the intelligence services themselves, the CIA, quite obviously, giving its expertise to the Greek intelligence services. All of which means that you have not only the right, but the extra-constitutional right. Neat. That was Truman Doctrine democracy. And the beneficiaries of that kind of regime, oh well, the Greek elite. No sense talking about Onassis and Yarkos. No sense talking about the fact that in 1967, for example, of all of the budget of Greece, only 16% came from direct taxes. No sense talking about the fact that there are all kinds of subsidies to these elitists, but what we're interested in are the American investments. And they come into Greece not in vast quantity, but enough to show that it had become a market. And between 1954 and 1964, in that 10-year period after the 53 law was passed, there were 341 contracts awarded under that law, of which 50% were American contracts. It meant that Dow Chemical was in Greece, it meant that Chrysler was in Greece, it meant that Reynolds Metal was there, but two are most interesting. Comes the contract of November of 1962, which is the contract called Esso Pappas. And Esso Pappas is, of course, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Thomas Pappas of Boston, of Greek descent, an entrepreneur. And that contract was fantastic. It was for an economic development of $119 million around the city of Salonika in Macedonia. And it gave virtually a monopoly on oil refining to this particular group, and it gave the potentiality for building then a steel works and a petrochemical works, which meant that Salonika, as a major center, and southern Macedonia would really be developed by this particular group. But even more fantastic, and you have to see really what the frontier is, even more fantastic was a contract of early 1966. Early 1966, that's after Papandreou has been ousted, after the king has intervened, when Stephanopoulos has come in as the prime minister, when all of Greek politics is good and conservative again, and there is a contract granted to Litton Industries. Now, Litton Industries is a conglomerate of rather bad repute. And it went into Greece because that was an economy of terrible repute. And consequently, it could do what it wanted. And the contract that Litton Industries signed in 1966 really is prototypical of what we mean by a neo-colonial situation. Because two entire Greek districts, the island of Crete to begin with and the western Peloponnese, were given over to Litton Industries to develop economically. That Litton Industries was called in as the kind of development agency in those two areas in which 1 million people or more live in Greek society. That Litton Industry was to plan the economic development, to give its technical advice, and to be paid by the Greek government 11% of the total value of all economic projects for its consulting fee. And then it was to go out and to find the capital for these projects and to be paid a 4% commission by the Greek government for finding this outside capital. Now, you know what the implication of that is. The implication is that there is not development in Greece. The implication is that growth does not mean development. That what you do is to put into the hands of people whose motivation is profit, who don't concern themselves with what the needs of the Greek people may be or what the rational development of the resources may be. You put into their hands the capacity really to develop two major provinces of that society. And quite obviously, when Litton went to work and invited foreign capital into Greece, it invited it in for tourism, for luxury housing, for the things, after all, on which outside capital felt it could make a fast killing. The impact, you see, of this foreign investment in Greece, the impact of this Truman Doctrine democracy which opens the market, is to mean that Greek resources are sometimes exploited but not developed for Greek industry. One thinks of bauxite. Secondly, that the consumer market is often a consumer market in luxury goods to cater to a very narrow sector of Greek society in the absence of things that are necessary. That in the third place, the decisions of what will be produced and what will be developed are left into foreign hands. All of that, you see, prototypical not only of Greece, but of Laos, of South Vietnam, of South Korea, of all of those places where the free market society has developed, and then came the crisis. And you see, this is the interesting thing about imperialism, and that is that it can never calculate what may happen. And so by 1963, something peculiar was happening in Greece. In the first place, that the Karamanlis regime, that kind of police state that had been established, had gone too far. The elections were too coercive. The stealing of the elections was too obvious. In 1961, according to Papandreou, 100,000 votes had been falsified in the city of Athens itself. And you see what that meant. It meant that the center, now unified into the Center Union Party by 1961, resented it. They were part of the elite too. They wanted their share, and they began to attack the regime for falsifying elections, for suppressing public liberties. And then there were these offshoots of these attacks. They began to attack corruption, that through the use of American aid, all sorts of special interests were getting rich. They began to attack even the kind of imputation that Karamanlis had to American foreign policy. Well, you see, it was embarrassing. Of all of the prime ministers of Europe, Karamanlis was the only one openly to congratulate John Kennedy at the time of the Pay of Pigs. And consequently, quite obviously, this seemed to be so much an agent. And the center began to cut its teeth on that, and the attack began to get really quite wide. But you're still talking about two elite parties. The big change is that the Center Union begins to get a mass base. And here understand that even if you have growth without development, you begin to get certain morphological changes in a society. In Greece, you don't get the great growth of a working class because you have very little industrial progress. But you do get, through all of this aid, through all of this foreign investment, you do get an increase in urbanization. You get an increase in the service trades, in the white-collar trades. You begin to get clerks in offices, salespeople, more professionals. In other words, you begin to get a petty bourgeoisie that resents being totally excluded from Greek public life. In addition to that, you have this wild inflation in the early 60s that begins to bring the peasants and the workers, really for the first time since the end of the Civil War, back into protest. The peasants begin to find voice. You begin to get insurrectionary movements among tobacco farmers in Macedonia, among the Corinth grape growers who simply cannot make ends meet, who suddenly find that they have a declining real income, workers who go out on wildcat strikes. All of that begins to crystallize behind the attacks of the Center Union. And George Papandreou, that same Papandreou who had been the British agent in 1943 and 44, Papandreou, after all, suddenly finds that he has a mass on his hands. The spring of 1963 is a turning point period because that left-wing party, EDA, begins to coordinate its propaganda. It makes a great campaign for imprisoned trade unionists, for those who have been imprisoned because they have been too militant. It begins to demand peace and neutrality and getting out of NATO. And you have that orchestrated along with the attacks of the Center Party on the corruption of the regime. And then you have an event. And it happens in April of 1963. And there is a deputy of EDA, of this left-wing party. And he is a doctor. And he is distinguished, and he has really a great public. And his name is Lambrakis. And Lambrakis goes to Salonika in April of 1963 to make a speech demanding that Greece get out of NATO, that it be neutralist, that it fight for peace, that it end its connections with American imperialism, and everywhere the police are, everywhere there are right-wing fascistic groups, and Lambrakis' life is in danger, and as he is at the head of that procession in Salonika on a motorcycle, he is assaulted and brutally murdered. And the murder of Lambrakis, who really was a distinguished god and a great loss to the Greek left, the murder of Lambrakis was fantastic. The funeral in Athens brought out 500,000 people. And consequently, there was, from that time, a movement so great in the streets that finally, on the 18th of May of 1963, Karamanlis, despite all that support from the monarchy, from the army, from the Americans, threw in the sponge and resigned. And there were elections then in October. And those elections in October came really under the sign of the first mass movement since the Civil War. And in those elections, the Papandreou Center Union Party won. And they won a clear majority of the seats. And at the beginning of 1964, suddenly you have a progressive government in Greece. And it's not socialist. And it's certainly not revolutionary, but it's the beginning of a new start. It is more neutralist, more anti-imperialist. It really thinks about the plight of poor people. There is an opening. And it was written about that period by Vasilikos. And Vasilikos, in this magnificent book, Z, which is about the murder of Lambrakis, and the fact that the murderers were then let off by the police. Tells us how it was at that funeral and what the mood was as this Papandreou government came in. And you see, he talks a little bit poetically about the soul of Lambrakis somehow affecting these people who came to that funeral. And so between two heavens, the soul followed the procession of the resurrection. She knew well now that the body had not died, since a whole people thronged around its coffin. She knew, too, that immortality is whatever survives in the memory of others. And the cry that reigned throughout the entire journey and throughout the entire funeral was, "He lives." No one would admit that death existed in the realm of the idea. Death exists only for the individuals who one day discover with stupefaction that their private little lives come to an abrupt end. And at that point they panic, and they shut themselves up in psychiatric hospitals to recover. There is no death when by falling you help a people to rise, when your monument has become the very scale and standard of a people. When they arrived there, the soul came to rest in profound anguish, like the kite at its zenith when you see it suddenly halt, a motionless speck in the sun, while on the ground the kite string in the child's hand relaxes, just as above deep waters his fishing line slackens inward without revealing the exact spot where it had touched the sea's floor. So proving once again that up and down are the same. Arrived there, the soul came to rest, waiting for them to set the body down so that she could descend, waiting for the earth to receive him so that she could hold head high, up and down, body and soul making only one, until after having come to a halt above the huge body of the halted world, at one point she had to descend again for a clearer view of an old woman dressed in black who darted through the crowd, pulling her hair hysterically and crying just as they laid him in the grave, "Wake up, Z, we're waiting for you, wake up," which sent a shock through the crowd, for this old woman, with her simple words, had expressed precisely what an entire people was feeling at that moment and would feel for the next year. And so there was that moment in 64 and 5, and it would be the last moment. The king got in the way, the Americans got in the way, the colonels got in the way, and the Truman Doctrine democracy then proceeded on its way after 1965. Remember all that. It's impossible, you see, if you are a people like the Greeks, to cope with this kind of sheer power. Literally impossible to make even the movement of 64 and 5 come out to any kind of viable terms. In the final analysis, it all gets wound up within a great international complex. It gets wound up in the recession of American power, if that recession then is a reality in our own time. And if there is a recession, then the Greeks will act again. Don't forget that.